On June 4, 1943, the German officer Hermann Böttcher stepped onto American soil for the first time. After 2 long weeks crossing the Atlantic aboard a U.S. Navy transport ship, he found himself disembarking at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia. His legs were still unsteady from the rough ocean journey, yet what truly made him stagger was not the ground beneath his feet, but the astonishing sight that met his eyes. Through the early morning haze, he witnessed a scene that clashed violently with everything 3 years of Nazi propaganda had taught him to believe about the United States. The docks of Norfolk were alive with a kind of energy that seemed both chaotic and strangely ordered. He saw white and black dockworkers laboring side by side, operating massive cranes and machinery that looked as if they belonged to some future century. Women in coveralls were managing heavy equipment, maneuvering cranes with practiced skill, while children darted between the gates selling newspapers to sailors and soldiers. Nobody screamed, nobody ran at the sight of German uniforms stepping onto American land. Life simply carried on as if nothing unusual had happened. To Böttcher it was madness. Die spinnen, die Amerikaner. He muttered under his breath, "The Americans are crazy." The shock deepened as he and his fellow prisoners looked more closely. The naval base itself sprawled across more than 300 acres. Its docks stretched as far as the eye could see, bristling with cranes that loaded and unloaded dozens of ships at the same time. In just a single morning, Böttcher later wrote, this one port handled more cargo than Hamburg, one of Germany's great ports, could manage in an entire week. Yet it wasn't simply the scale of the operation that left the prisoners stunned. It was the ordinariness of it all. Civilians wandered freely near sensitive military installations. Vendors sold hot coffee and fresh donuts within sight of warships. A brass band, completely indifferent to the presence of enemy soldiers, played popular tunes for a nearby war bond rally. Around 500 German prisoners, veterans of the Afrika Korps, were marched into formation on American soil. They were the first major contingent of what would eventually grow to 425 German prisoners of war held in the United States by the war's end. For the men accustomed to strict secrecy, rigid discipline, and constant militarization, America was a bewildering place. What they saw contradicted every expectation. They had been taught that America was decadent, chaotic, weak. Yet here was a society so secure in its power that it behaved as though enemies in its midst were little more than unwelcome guests. The sight was not one of fear, but of confidence. And for soldiers indoctrinated into the harsh world, of the Third Reich, these simple scenes of daily American life were already working on them in ways no battlefield defeat could. Processing began immediately at Norfolk, and here too the Germans encountered what Böttcher later described in his memoir as the first impossibility. German military doctrine had always viewed prisoners as either exploitable assets or disposable burdens. The Geneva Convention was followed when convenient, ignored when not. Yet in Norfolk, American officers addressed them in fluent German and read aloud the rules of the Geneva Convention, explaining their rights in detail. They were even asked about dietary needs. Jewish American personnel, some with obviously Jewish surnames, distributed Red Cross packages while informing the prisoners that kosher meals could be provided for any Jewish soldiers among them. At first, the Germans assumed this was mockery, some cruel joke at their expense, but it was real. The American army had actually prepared to meet even the religious dietary requirements of their enemies. Medical inspections followed, and again the Germans whirled, "You cracked." Wounded prisoners were given the same penicillin treatments as American soldiers, a drug so rare in Germany that even frontline field hospitals scarcely possessed it. A Swiss Red Cross inspector would later note in his report that the care given to German POW at Norfolk equaled, and in some cases exceeded, the care provided to American troops. The situation was even more disorienting when African American medical staff carried out routine procedures, such as drawing blood from Wehrmacht officers. In Nazi Germany, such racial contact was not only forbidden but punishable by law. Yet here it was routine military practice. Perhaps the most incomprehensible moment came when the prisoners were escorted to their first meal. They entered a mess hall where American sailors were already eating. Instead of being segregated into hidden barracks or made to eat separately in degrading conditions, the Germans were seated within the same facility as their recent battlefield enemies. Americans ate at one end, Germans at the other, but they stood in the same food lines and received the same quality of meals. No guards barked orders, no sense of humiliation lingered in the air. The American sailors seemed more interested in listening to a baseball game on the radio than in the presence of their enemies just a few feet away. For the German prisoners, this was more than culture shock. It was an assault on the very ideological foundations they had been raised in. Nazi propaganda had depicted America as a land of corruption, racial chaos, and weak, lazy people unfit for serious war. But in Norfolk, they saw a nation abundant in resources, confident in its strength, and most of all, so secure in its identity that it could treat enemies with dignity instead of hatred. For Böttcher and the thousands who arrived with him, this was only the beginning of a journey that would utterly transform their understanding of America and of themselves. After their first bewildering hours at Norfolk, the German prisoners were quickly organized for transport deeper into the American interior, instead of being herded into cattle cars or hidden away in sealed trains, as they would have expected from their own government's treatment of prisoners. They were seated in actual passenger coaches. Cushioned seats, clean windows, and regular meal stops greeted men who had braced themselves for chains and humiliation. For soldiers hardened by North Africa's deserts and the Atlantic's peril, this was not just comfort. It was an ideological challenge. Why would their enemies bother treating them as passengers instead of captives? The train journey itself only deepened their confusion. In Germany, all prisoner transfers had been shrouded in secrecy, carried out at night or in isolated routes, far from the gaze of civilians. But in America, their transport was conducted openly, almost casually. Their trains stopped at major stations, sometimes in the very heart of cities, where civilians gathered out of curiosity. At Washington, D.C., Union Station, hundreds of people watched them through the windows. The scene was surreal. American families, dressed in their best clothes, waved good-bye to young recruits headed for training camps. Wives kissed husbands openly, children clutched flags, and teenagers shared milkshakes in the station's restaurant. On the very same platform, separated only by thin glass and a few indifferent guards, sat the prisoners of war, their sworn enemies. Yet instead of hostility, they encountered indifference or even mild amusement. Life went on around them, unbothered by their presence. The Americans' openness extended beyond the stations. As the trains rolled through industrial corridors, the Germans were able to see factories and shipyards in full operation. In Germany, such sites would have been camouflaged, guarded, or hidden from view, lest an enemy spy gain vital intelligence. But here, industry operated in plain sight, the Glen L. Martin Aircraft Plant in Baltimore, for instance, proudly displayed its name in massive letters on the side of its hangars. Parking lots were filled with the personal automobiles of workers, a sign of prosperity that left the German officers speechless. From their windows, they could literally count the B-26 bombers lined up for delivery. There was no paranoia, no secrecy, only confidence in overwhelming capacity. As the trains pushed deeper into Pennsylvania, the sights became even more startling. Coal mines and steel mills glowed orange in the night, their furnaces running continuously, belching smoke and fire into the sky. To the prisoners, it was as though the entire landscape pulsed with energy. But it wasn't just the scale of production that unsettled them. It was the quality of life they saw surrounding it. Instead of grim industrial barracks, they observed neat rows of houses with gardens, electricity shining in every window, and radio antennas sprouting from rooftops. At a stop in Harrisburg, they witnessed workers ending their shifts, many of them wearing wristwatches and polished shoes, carrying lunch boxes, and climbing into personal cars. To German soldiers who had fought over scraps of food in Africa, one image remained particularly jarring. A worker tossed aside a half-eaten apple only to pull out another fresh one from his lunchbox. That kind of casual waste by an ordinary laborer was unthinkable in war-torn Europe. By the time the trains reached Texas, the Germans were already disoriented. Nothing fit the image they had been taught to believe about the enemy. And their astonishment only grew when they arrived at Camp Hearn in Robertson County, Texas, in December 1942. The camp, designed to hold up to 800 prisoners, was unlike anything they could have imagined. Instead of squalor and punishment, they found barracks equipped with electric lights, hot water, and flush toilets, luxuries many had never enjoyed in their civilian lives back home. Each man was given an individual bed with a mattress, sheets, and blankets. Recreation halls offered ping-pong tables, musical instruments, and libraries stocked with books. The camp's hospital surpassed even German civilian standards. It had X-ray machines, surgical suites, and supplies of penicillin that were scarce across Europe. When one prisoner, Georg Gärtner, fell ill with appendicitis, he was rushed into surgery within hours. American doctors performed the procedure with assistance from German medical staff among the prisoners. For men accustomed to thinking of themselves as expendable tools of war, this level of care was bewildering. What shocked them most, however, was the degree of self-governance granted inside the camp. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Stiles, the camp commander, addressed the Germans in fluent German and explained that they would elect their own spokesmen, organize activities and manage their schedules, so long as they followed general regulations. For men raised in an authoritarian system, the idea that their enemies trusted them to govern themselves seemed either like weakness or some kind of trap. But as weeks turned into months, they realized it was genuine. Perhaps nothing encapsulated the surreal quality of their new lives better than the camp canteen. Stocked with goods ranging from cigarettes and chocolate to art supplies and musical instruments, it allowed prisoners to make purchases using scrip they earned from voluntary labor. The concept was nearly incomprehensible. Not only were they being fed and clothed, they were allowed to shop, to make choices, to exercise freedoms that seemed almost luxurious. This combination of abundance, freedom, and trust began to erode their certainty. They had arrived in America expecting to be despised, degraded, and locked away. Instead, they were being treated with a humanity that challenged every principle instilled in them by Nazi ideology. As one inspector from the International Red Cross later observed, the conditions at Camp Hearn did not merely meet Geneva Convention standards. They often surpassed the living standards that many of the Germans had known in their own country. For the prisoners, the journey from Norfolk to Texas was not just a physical relocation. It was the first stage of a profound psychological journey. Each sight along the way, each casual display of American abundance, each act of unexpected decency, was like a hammer blow against the rigid structure of their beliefs. The United States had not sought to indoctrinate them with propaganda. Instead, it had exposed them to reality, and reality itself was beginning to accomplish what no leaflet or lecture could, the slow, steady dismantling of their worldview. By the time the German prisoners settled into life at Camp Hearn, Texas, they had already experienced a series of shocks that unsettled everything they thought they knew about America. But what awaited them inside the barbed wire fences was even more transformative. This was not a prison of misery or deprivation, but something closer to a small, self-contained town, complete with barracks, hospitals, libraries, churches, recreation halls, and even a store. It was, in many ways, a community where enemies were given a strange kind of freedom that defied military logic. The barracks themselves were far from the bleak, overcrowded huts they had envisioned. Each man had his own bed, complete with sheets and blankets. Hot water flowed through showers, and flush toilets replaced the primitive latrines the soldiers were used to in the field. At night, Electric lights illuminated the rooms, a luxury that many of the prisoners had not even enjoyed in their villages back in Germany. Recreation halls offered spaces to read, play ping, pong, or practice music. The camp library began with only a few hundred volumes but quickly expanded to thousands of books, many of them banned under Nazi rule, works by Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, and even Jewish authors like Lion Feuchtwanger. To read these books openly, without fear of punishment, was an experience almost revolutionary in itself. The camp hospital was equally astonishing. It boasted X-ray machines, surgical facilities, and stocks of the new wonder drug penicillin. For men who had watched their comrades die for lack of basic medical supplies in Africa or Russia, it was staggering to see American doctors treating them with the same dedication as they gave to their own troops. One memorable case was that of Georg Gärtner, who developed appendicitis in 1943. Within hours, he was given surgery by an American doctor, assisted by fellow German medical staff. Such treatment for a prisoner, an enemy, was unthinkable by the standards of Nazi military culture. But perhaps the greatest shock came with the camp's self-governance. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Stiles, the camp commander, explained in fluent German that the prisoners would elect their own spokesman and manage many aspects of their daily lives. For men raised in an authoritarian system where every decision flowed from above, this was baffling. Was it a trick, a weakness? Yet over time they saw that the Americans meant it. Committees formed, barracks leaders were elected, and activities ranging from theatrical plays to sports tournaments were organized by the prisoners themselves. Democracy, even within a prison camp, was something they had never lived before. Then there was the canteen, a store stocked with goods that prisoners could buy using scrip earned from voluntary labor. Cigarettes, chocolate, soap, stationery, even musical instruments were available for purchase. The idea that prisoners could shop at all seemed absurd. Yet there it was, a miniature marketplace where men who only months before had been fighting against America now browsed for luxuries. For many, this was their first taste of personal choice beyond survival needs, and it left a lasting impression. The work programs extended this strange sense of freedom beyond the camp fences. By late 1943, America's labor shortages had become severe, especially in agriculture. The War Manpower Commission authorized German prisoners to work on farms, ranches, and in non-military industries. At first, many Germans viewed the assignment with suspicion. Would they be humiliated, treated as slaves? Instead, they found themselves paid 80 cents per day in scrip, the same base pay as American privates, and more importantly, they worked side by side with American civilians. At the massive King Ranch near Kingsville, Texas, German POW encountered agriculture on a scale unimaginable in Europe. The ranch sprawled over 825,000 acres, larger than the entire state of Rhode Island. There they labored alongside Mexican, American vaqueros and African-American ranch hands, a kind of racial mixing that shredded Nazi ideology. The Germans had been taught that inferior races were incapable of real productivity. Yet here, Mexican and black workers not only held their own but often outperformed the Germans. Prisoners were equally stunned by mechanization. A single combine harvester replaced dozens of men. Trucks, not horses, hauled crops. Airplanes flew overhead to survey cattle herds. In Germany, such machinery was rare, reserved for the very largest estates. In America, it was routine. And perhaps most disorienting of all, they witnessed casual abundance. Workers took regular breaks, listened to radios while they labored, and wasted food in quantities that made German soldiers cringe. One prisoner recalled a farm worker casually throwing away a sandwich crust, a gesture that would have been unthinkable in starving Europe. What truly shook the prisoners, however, was not just the material abundance but the social environment. American farmers spoke freely, criticizing government policies, even insulting officials without fear of punishment. In Nazi Germany, such words could mean imprisonment or worse. At one farm near Bryan, Texas, a farmer cursed a Department of Agriculture inspector to his face, and nothing happened to him. For Germans raised in a culture of absolute obedience, this was almost beyond comprehension. Local newspapers soon picked up stories of the German POW working in the community. Articles in papers like the Hearn Democrat or the Bryan Daily Eagle described encounters between prisoners and townspeople, often with a note of curiosity rather than hostility. By December 1943, the POW were even allowed supervised Christmas shopping trips in nearby towns. There they witnessed American youth culture in full bloom. Teenagers gathering at soda fountains, boys and girls laughing together without chaperones, dancing to jukebox music, often jazz or swing. The very music Nazi propaganda had condemned as degenerate. Women drove trucks, ran businesses, supervised factories, and even flew planes as part of the Women Air Force Service pilots program. For the Germans, who had been told women belonged only in the home, this was shocking. Yet it was real, and it was everywhere. All these experiences began to chip away at the world. They had carried with them across the Atlantic. They had expected to find cruelty, resentment, and humiliation. Instead, they found decency, prosperity, and freedom woven into everyday life. The barbed wire around them reminded them they were prisoners, but beyond it, they could see a society that functioned with confidence, generosity, and trust. Slowly, imperceptibly, that reality began to erode the rigid walls of Nazi ideology and open their minds to new possibilities. By late 1943, the German prisoners at Camp Hearn had already begun to feel the cracks forming in their worldview. Every day brought some new shock. The abundance of American farms, the casual freedoms of civilians, the unexpected trust of their captors. But the U.S. military had something far more deliberate in mind. Beyond food, comfort, and labor, there was a quiet campaign underway, an effort to reshape the thinking of these men, not through force or propaganda, but through education, culture, and exposure to American values in their most ordinary forms. It began with books. At first, the camp library was stocked modestly, but within months it expanded into a collection of thousands of volumes. Donations poured in from local citizens and from the American Library Association's Books for Prisoners A program. Many of these works were ones the Nazis had banned back home. The prisoners could now read Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, or works by Jewish authors like Lion Feuchtwanger. To read such books openly, without fear of punishment, was not simply entertainment. It was liberation. Each page presented an alternative to the rigid authoritarianism they had known, exposing them to new ideas that Nazi censorship had tried to erase. Education programs soon followed. Sam Houston State Teachers College, today Sam Houston State University, partnered with the camp to provide correspondence courses. By 1944, hundreds of German POW were enrolled in classes on English, American history, mathematics, and agricultural science. Professors even traveled to the camp to deliver lectures and administer exams. For men whose wartime lives had revolved around discipline, destruction, and survival, the chance to sit in classrooms and study felt surreal. Some later admitted that this was the first time they began to imagine a future beyond the war. The prisoners themselves contributed to this atmosphere of learning. They started their own camp newspaper, Der Spiegel, the Mirror, not to be confused with the later German magazine of the same name. At first, its articles echoed Nazi propaganda, with rigid defenses of the Reich and its ideology. But over time, the tone shifted. By 1944, the paper contained democratic discussions, critical reflections, and even humor that would have been impossible under Nazi censorship. The slow transformation was undeniable. Yet it was not only books and classes that reshaped these men. Culture seeped in from every corner of American life. Local churches welcomed the prisoners into their congregations. Records from the First Baptist Church of Hearn, the Methodist Church, and St. Mary's Catholic Church showed German POW attending services, sitting alongside American families whose sons were overseas fighting against them. The act was almost unthinkable, enemies kneeling together in prayer, united not by politics or nationality, but by faith. Then came Christmas 1943. For many of the prisoners, this moment became the turning point in their perception of America. The town of Herne, population barely 2,000, mobilized to ensure that even enemy soldiers would have a proper holiday celebration. Churches, schools, civic organizations, and families came together to provide nearly 5,000 gift packages, far more than the number of prisoners in the camp. Local schools made handmade cards and decorations. The American Legion, veterans of World War I who had fought against Germans a generation earlier, donated cigarettes, candy, and sports equipment. The Lions Club provided musical instruments. The Garden Club decorated the camp with evergreens and holly. The centerpiece of the celebration was a towering 30-foot Christmas tree erected inside the compound, strung with electric lights that burned brightly through the night. For the Germans, this alone was almost incomprehensible. In their villages, electricity had been rationed even in peacetime, and by 1943, most German households had long since surrendered such luxuries to the demands of the war. To see so many lights blazing simply for decoration was staggering. The holiday feast deepened the sense of astonishment. Quartermaster Records lists the menu: roast turkey, ham, sweet potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce, vegetables, mince pie, apple pie, ice cream, and even alcohol, beer for the enlisted men, wine for the officers. Each man consumed nearly 5,000 calories that day, more than 4 times the daily ration available to civilians in Germany. For prisoners who had once fought over scraps in Africa, it was overwhelming. The emotional climax came with the music. The Methodist church choir, led by a woman whose own son was fighting in Italy, performed German Christmas carols they had painstakingly learned phonetically. American mothers, their voices trembling with emotion, sang in the language of their sons' enemies. For many prisoners, this act broke through whatever remained of their ideological armor. They could not understand how a nation at war could show such generosity, how families with loved ones on the front lines could extend kindness to the very men who represented the enemy. Several prisoners later admitted that they wept openly that night. For Hermann Böttcher, the officer whose observations would later be published in his memoir Behind Barbed Wire, that Christmas became the moment of transformation. These people whose sons we had tried to kill gave us gifts, he wrote. Their kindness wasn't weakness but strength, the confidence of victors who knew they had already won not just the war but the peace that would follow. Böttcher was not alone. Many prisoners would later recall that it was Christmas in Texas, more than any other single moment, that convinced them that America's strength lay not in its weapons or factories, but in its humanity. The U.S. Army Special Projects Division monitored these cultural exchanges carefully, categorizing prisoners into anti-Nazis, non-political men, and hardened believers. But what proved most effective was not direct indoctrination. It was ordinary life, books, church services, music, and the sight of communities treating enemies with dignity. America's most powerful weapon was not propaganda, but reality itself. By the end of 1943, the seeds of change had been planted. Many of the men who had arrived at Norfolk full of suspicion, resentment, and loyalty to the Reich now began to question the values they had been taught. And for some, the memories of Christmas 1943 at Camp Herne would stay with them forever, not as prisoners of war, but as the first moment they began to feel like human beings again. As the war dragged on into 1944 and 1945, German prisoners across America found themselves caught between two worlds. Behind the fences they were still soldiers of the Reich, sworn to fight for Hitler, but in their daily lives they were exposed to a society that contradicted everything they had been taught about enemies, power, and freedom. Over time, this exposure accomplished something extraordinary. It reshaped thousands of men from indoctrinated followers of a totalitarian regime into individuals who carried back to Europe the seeds of democratic renewal. The U.S. military, through its Special Projects Division, carefully monitored this transformation. Psychologists, educators, and intelligence officers categorized the prisoners into three groups: roughly 10% who were openly anti-Nazi, 5% who were considered non-political and could be swayed, and a stubborn 15% who remained ardent believers in Hitler's ideology. The army did not attempt to indoctrinate them with heavy-handed propaganda. Instead, it orchestrated a subtler approach. Anti-Nazis were given leadership roles within the camps, running newspapers, moderating discussions, and guiding activities. Non-political prisoners were quietly nudged toward exposure to democratic ideals through literature, debates, and education programs. The hardline Nazis were isolated and monitored, their influence deliberately weakened. What truly mattered, however, was not the formal programs but the lived reality. The men saw American democracy in action, often in ways that seemed chaotic but were, in truth, deeply resilient. Newspapers available in the camps openly criticized the government, reported military setbacks, and mocked political leaders. To German officers accustomed to strict censorship, this looked like sabotage. How could a nation at war allow such dissent? Yet the war effort only grew stronger, not weaker, under the weight of competing voices. When the 1944 presidential election pitted Franklin D. Roosevelt against Thomas Dewey, the prisoners were astounded. In Germany, changing leaders in the middle of a war would have been seen as suicide. But in America, democracy continued to function without collapsing the war effort. Beyond politics, daily exposure to American society chipped away at ideological certainty. Prisoners working in factories saw workers suggesting improvements to production lines, competing for bonuses, and taking pride in their output as if it were a sport. They witnessed American efficiency not as the result of harsh discipline, but of motivation, choice, and trust. On farms, they saw racial groups working side by side, often outperforming the German laborers. They observed American women in roles they had never imagined: pilots, factory supervisors, business owners. Each contradiction piled upon the last until the old Nazi world. You seemed not just flawed but absurd. The statistics tell part of the story. Out of 425, 0 German prisoners held in the United States, fewer than 300 attempted escape. Only 4 managed to remain free for more than 30 days. Acts of sabotage were almost non-existent. In contrast, over 80% of prisoners volunteered for labor assignments, often returning from farms or factories with stories of kindness from American civilians. When the war ended, surveys conducted by U.S. occupation authorities found that nearly 3/4 of the returning POW held favorable views of American democracy. More than half openly supported cooperation with the United States in rebuilding Germany. Some of the transformations were deeply personal. Hermann Böttcher, once a convinced Nazi, admitted in his memoir that the turning point came not on the battlefield, but during Christmas 1943, when American families gave gifts to the very men who had been their enemies. He emigrated to the United States after the war, became a citizen, and worked as an engineer for General Motors. Georg Gärtner, who famously escaped from Camp Deeming in New Mexico, chose not to flee America but to remain hidden within it, marrying an American woman and living under an assumed name for decades. Reinhold Pabel, another escapee, lived illegally in Chicago for years, eventually marrying and becoming a successful businessman. These men, who had once fought to destroy America, instead chose to make it their home. But the influence extended far beyond the individuals who immigrated. Thousands of former POW carried back to Germany the lessons they had learned in captivity. They had seen firsthand that democracy did not mean weakness, that diversity did not mean disorder, and that prosperity came not from oppression but from opportunity. When West Germany began its reconstruction after the war, many of these former prisoners took up roles as teachers, mayors, businessmen, and even members of the Bundestag. Their experiences in America, informed their vision of what a democratic Germany could become. Historians later called it one of the most successful re-education programs in history, not because it was imposed from above, but because it happened organically through exposure to ordinary life. America's greatest weapon was not propaganda or intimidation, but the confidence to live its values openly, even in front of enemies. The POW had expected brutality and found kindness. They had expected deprivation and found abundance. They had expected fear and found freedom. By the time Camp Hirn closed in December 1945, the men who walked out of its gates were not the same as those who had arrived. They carried with them memories of American families who sang to them at Christmas, farmers who argued with government officials without fear, workers who discarded food as casually as they criticized politicians. For many, these images were as shocking as any battle, but instead of destroying them, they rebuilt them. Decades later, when former prisoners returned to Texas for reunions, they embraced their former guards as friends. They laid flowers at American memorials and spoke openly of how their time in captivity had reshaped their lives. One veteran, Fritz Zimmermann, summarized it best. "We came as enemies believing in racial superiority and national destiny. We left as friends, understanding that democracy's chaos is its strength." In the end, the unusual sights that stunned the German POW in America proved more powerful than bombs or bullets. They had come expecting to see weakness, but instead saw strength. They had come expecting hatred, but instead encountered humanity. And in those encounters lay the foundation not only for their personal transformations, but for the rebirth of Germany itself. America's true victory, it turned out, was not won on the battlefield. It was won in its prison camps, where enemies became allies, and where the simple reality of freedom proved stronger than any ideology.